tarde então a todos. Bem-vindos a mais uma sessão dos Diálogos do Cérebro, que é uma série de conferências que acompanha a nossa exposição Cérebro Mais Vasto que o Céu. O tema de hoje é The Smelling Brain, em português o cérebro e o olfato. E antes de passar a apresentar os nossos conferencistas de hoje, tinha apenas um pequeno anúncio a fazer, que está relacionado com o outro ciclo de eventos que também acompanha a exposição e que é o ciclo de cinema, que teve há 8 dias atrás a sua conferência de lançamento e em relação ao qual, infelizmente, tenho que vos dizer que tivemos que adiar a próxima sessão porque existem dificuldades com os direitos de exibição do filme em questão, em que o distribuidor nacional já não tem os direitos e há um vazio legal, digamos assim, de quem detém os direitos do filme. Portanto, estamos a tentar resolver a situação e, portanto, oportunamente comunicaremos uma nova data para a exibição desse mesmo filme e ficam também desde já convidados para virem, se assim o entenderem, a essa sessão de eventos. Portanto, sem mais demoras, passava então a apresentar os nossos conferencistas de hoje. Hoje temos uns diálogos do cérebro bilíngues, com um orador nacional e um orador internacional. Vamos usar as duas línguas durante esta sessão de hoje e está uma tradução simultânea disponível para quem assim o desejar, quer de inglês para português, quer de português para inglês. Hoje connosco temos o prazer de ter o professor Gun Chemin. O professor Gun Chemin é um psicólogo formado pela London School of Economics na área da psicologia social, que depois fez uma carreira científica que passou por Sussex, mais tarde por Amsterdão e pela Universidade de Utrecht, até recentemente, há coisa de 5 anos, se ter fixado em Lisboa e nos ter dado o prazer de passar a ser nosso conterrâneo aqui em Lisboa. Está sediado no ISPA e veio dirigir uma nova unidade de investigação, que é o William James Research Center, na área da psicologia. O professor Gun Chemin tem trabalhado sobre comunicação social em humanos e aquilo que nos vem falar hoje é de como nós também comunicamos, mesmo de forma não consciente, através do olfato e através de estímulos químicos e, portanto, através de estímulos olfativos também conseguimos recolher informação, por exemplo, sobre estados emocionais de outros. Depois, na segunda parte, para estabelecer este diálogo com o professor Gun Chemin, temos o prazer da presença do engenheiro José Bento dos Santos, que é atualmente o presidente da Academia Portuguesa de Gastronomia, mas cuja formação académica vem da engenharia química e depois de profissionalmente ter aplicado os conhecimentos na indústria do ouro e de outras áreas profissionais que para aqui não dizem muito respeito, ganhou também muita notoriedade com a sua presença na crítica gastronómica, com a presença que teve na televisão e nos jornais a nível da crítica da gastronomia e da apresentação da gastronomia e também na área dos vinhos, e é também produtor de vinhos e que nos vem falar de como nós usamos também o olfato nessa área tão importante das nossas vidas como é experienciar um bom vinho. E, portanto, aquilo que propomos aqui hoje é estabelecer um diálogo entre estes nossos dois convidados, de como o olfato, no fundo, é por nós utilizado de uma forma que por vezes nos pode surpreender. Como vocês, se já visitaram a exposição, provavelmente viram, cerca de 30% do nosso córtex é dedicado ao processamento de informação visual. Nós somos considerados, sobretudo, animais visuais, damos também um pouco de importância à audição, mas dos famosos 5 sentidos que temos, o olfato tende a ser um pouco negligenciado na importância que pode ter nas nossas vidas. E, portanto, aquilo que pretendemos hoje aqui é desmistificar um pouco esta ideia do segundo plano que o olfato pode ter nas nossas vidas, contando com a presença destes nossos dois ilustres convidados. E, portanto, sem mais demoras, convidava o professor Gun Chemin para o palco. A seguir-se-á a palestra do engenheiro José Bento dos Santos. Não existirá tempo para perguntas entre os dois. E depois, no final, iniciaremos então uma conversa que se estenderá e que se abrirá para a plateia. Portanto, sem mais demoras, Gun, por favor. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Rui. It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, everybody. As you know, I am going to talk about smell and things related to smell. Before I start, I must admit that I work on a Macintosh, which obviously I prefer anytime to a PC, a major point of contention at the university. I brought my laptop, but what I have on the Macintosh has been translated to a PC, and they don't get on very well with each other. So things are slightly skewed, and I hope the bits that are relevant are readable, seeable, and hearable. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? Let me give you an overview, first of all. I'm going to start talking about how do we smell, what happens when we smell something. Then how do other volatiles travel and what they do. This is going to be a very short part. I'm going to present that very briefly. Then I'm going to talk about how good we are at talking about smell and how good we are at smelling smell. And those are two different things. So I'm going to talk about that a bit longer. Then I'm going to talk about these creatures. They're all the same. It's going to be very brief, but it's going to actually introduce me to the next section, which is the rest of the important pieces, humans, what happens with humans and smelling. And that's going to be the longer part. And finally, I'm going to talk about one piece of research we've done recently, published recently, on whether we can communicate via odors to dogs and how that takes place. So I'm going to give you some films there as well. Olfaction. What you have in olfaction is a route of inhaled air that goes to the nasal cavity, and then it goes to the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. Basically, the molecules in odor molecules actually stick or get stuck to the mucus, which then actually have direct activation of a whole range of neurons. And the molecules, again repeated here, go to the odorant receptor. Odorants bind to the receptors. The receptor cells are activated and send electric signals. The signals are relayed in the olfactory bulb, and then eventually they reach the brain. So that's basically, very crudely, the process that is involved in smelling. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. And now I'm going to talk about how good are we. And this has been an issue which has kept us busy since Aristotle and Plato. And their verdict is the same over the centuries. So if you have somebody like Condillac, 18th century mechanical philosopher, he says, of all the senses, it is the one which appears to contribute least to the cognitions of the human mind. Charles Darwin said, smell is of extremely slight service. Kant, regarded as the most dispensable of the senses. Gardner said, little special value across cultures. Man has left the world of smells. Cognitive and neuroscience have expressed the belief that smell is insignificant for humans. It is extremely rudimentary. And then Pinker, a famous psycholinguist, among other things, says smell is vestigial. So, and this actually, to some extent, corresponds to what is shared in everyday life. How good are we? So there's a study by a colleague, Asifa Majid, and all those people, these are different people, across a whole range of cultures, and they examined the words, the language for smell. What you have is they used the Aristotelian hierarchy. So smell is the weakest, taste, touch, audition, and vision. There's an entirely different rationale for this, but what is interesting is if you take a look across cultures, it's a huge range. This is the smell, the linguistic availability, and it's actually very weak. Everything else, and this is the highest concordance between different concepts, the smell concepts are actually extremely weak concepts. So the linguistic representation of smell is virtually very vague, ambiguous. The question is that a reflection of the reality? Is that a reflection of our sense of smell? Well, humans are actually capable of discriminating between odors, and it's a remarkable ability. we can discriminate more than 1 trillion odors. That's amazing. That's much more powerful than, this is content, it's not, there's a discussion about this, but it's still substantial. It's much better than our ability to discriminate colors and tones. So our smell sense is actually extremely sensitive. If you put 3 droplets of an odor in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, people can discriminate that from one that has no mixture of odors. So again, you can pick up the slightest cues with your net smell sense with no difficulty. How good are we? The obvious comparison in some ways is between super smellers, which are dogs or mice, and human beings. And there's a study done by some colleagues in the Weizmann Institute in Israel, where they actually examined how dogs and humans can trace an odor. So this is about tracking smell. On the left-hand side, you see a yellow line, which is where the pheasant has been pulled through, and the red signs are how a dog tracks the smell. On the right-hand side, this is a chocolate essential oil. Again, this yellow line is where it was pulled, and this is how a human being actually tracks the same thing, and there's no difference. So this extremely acute way of orientating yourself. That doesn't mean that our linguistic ability reflects that acuity, but the physical and neural activities are sufficiently sophisticated to track these things. You must have seen this on the streets. I mean, whenever 2 dogs see each other, what they do is, the next thing, they're each other's hinds or butts, like this. But what are they doing? They are at on the left and the right side of the anus, there are 2 glands. And they actually excrete specific types of liquid, which is very important. And that liquid gives them information. The information is actually quite elaborate. And in fact, George Pretty, who's at the Munsell in the States, has done research on this. They extract information as to whether the dog is a male or a female, how old it is, what it eats, how healthy it is, what kind of mood they're in, whether the other dog is a stranger or if they're familiar with it. So there's an enormous amount of information that they can actually pull out from the small encounter that every time 2 dogs come and smell each other's butts. So it's not what some people would automatically think what they're smelling. That's what they're just smelling the glands. How about human beings? Do we smell each other? Well, take a look at this video. It's a video of an experiment conducted by the Weizmann Institute, where a participant is in a room, an experimental room with a lot of equipment, and then there's an experimenter coming in. I'm telling you also because there are some important things there that you have to see. Shakes the hand, and then disappears. This is a very short episode, and look what's going to happen. And take a look what's going to happen after the shaking of the hand. And underneath it, you will see the breathing. So this measures.
This is an experiment from the control study that included concurrent recording of nasal airflow. Here you see the baseline condition, where the subject is just not moving much. Here enters the experimenter for the agreed event, including a handshake. You can see that nasal respiration will go slightly flat when the subject in fact talks to the experimenter. The experimenter now leaves the room and the subject samples right away. We will now return to this image, highlighting in green the point in time where you'll see the cursor denoting the pronounced sniff concurrent with bringing the hand to the nose.
Okay. No different from a dog. And in fact, if you think about it, there are numerous ways in which we relate to each other physically without knowing what type of information we're passing. But we hug each other, we embrace each other, we hold each other, we do cheek kissing, we do nose kissing, we do kissing in general. And oops, this is too early. Basically, we sample information, but it is information that is not verbalizable and not reaching consciousness. So we are no different, in a sense, from dogs. We do the same thing, except that seeing the dogs do it seems odd, whereas humans doing it seems natural. Well, it isn't. It's both natural. What do we sniff? And it's basically sweat from the apocrine glands. So it's on the armpit, and that's where the information, the excretions of the apocrine gland are the most informative pieces of information, most informative pieces of chemosignals, which I'm going to talk about more. There are a whole range of different studies, which I'm going to just list individually and focus on the type of information that the apocrine gland excretions actually convey. And then I'm going to give you one example which has to do with excretion of apocrine glands under conditions of emotion. So I'm going to talk about 3 conditions of emotion. When people are in a fear state, induced via films, and the sweat is sampled while they're watching it, disgust states, and happiness states. So what you do is you expose people to these films, and then you actually collect their sweat, and then you administer it to participants who are the recipients. So you have donors and recipients. I won't go into the details. Collecting sweat is not because of the odor, but because of the work, a pain in the neck. It's a long, time-consuming activity. So what you find in sweat and what is communicated in sweat is, for instance, emotional state, which I'm going to talk about. Illness, gender, sexual preference, sexual arousal, kin, whether somebody's a kin or not, mate compatibility. So there's all this information is contained in the excretion of an apocrine gland at the same time. Although these studies are individual studies, if you could do all the different ways of measuring or identifying the processes, you would find all of these, certainly the static ones, such as sexual preference, kin, mate compatibility. The other ones are dynamic, emotional state, illness, they change. So the sweat, and that's what's interesting about chemosignals or sweat, it's the same word. It contains an enormous range of information at the same time, which is very different from other types of information that we are exposed to. And of course, you also find that personality traits such as extroversion are actually manifested in the sweat. So, how do you find out? How do you find out these properties? Well, you can't ask people, because linguistic representation of the particular qualities that are actually manifested are very difficult. We don't have the vocabulary in the first place. So you need some techniques. And to do that, we have to adopt specific ways around language. I talked about the sweat donors and recipients. For instance, one of them is electromyography. Basically, when you express yourself facially, when you smile or whatever, your facial muscles get activated. And what you can do is examine the type of muscles activated given a particular smell. So if it's a fear smell, or fear odor, which I'm going to talk first now, you actually do this. So this muscle gets activated, as well as your nasal aperture increases. Your vision actually becomes broader. And that makes a lot of sense, because one of the things you're doing when you're in a fearful state is trying to scan the environment in all possible modalities that you have in order to find out what's frightening. Okay, so it's an adaptive reaction. It's not maladaptive. Of course, it also serves a second function, which is the facial communicative function. So when you see the face, you say, oh, the person is afraid. If you go to something like expression of disgust, you get different muscles activated. So you go, ooh. You're actually closing yourself against any type of pathogen that can be actually infecting you or influencing you. Obviously, disgust has been generalized to different types of moral disgust and things like that, but one of the distinctive features is when you do this, you're closing yourself. You're closing your eyes, your vision, peripheral vision decreases, your nasal intake decreases. So again, it has a defensive function. And when you're happy, you have an entirely different expression. I'll come to that. Let me start with fear. So what you have is fear odor. We give this to the participant who is actually the recipient, and you can see specific things. So this particular muscle, medial frontalis, gets activated. You measure that by putting electrodes. Vision becomes more peripheral, perception is enhanced, and your air intake increases as well. So all these three things you can measure, and we have measured them. I'm just going to give you an example with the muscle activity. Subjects are exposed to disgust sweat, fear sweat, and a control sweat. You have to find out what the differences are, okay? And we're measuring each muscle individually. This is the medial frontalis. This is this one I said here. And what you find is that when there's fear sweat, medial frontalis gets activated, electrical discharge, significantly, whereas the other sweats, the disgust sweat and control doesn't do anything. Okay? So you can actually say, oh, okay, the person is actually simulating via the odor a state of fear. Disgust, you have again vision. As I told you, this is a different muscle that's being activated, and then intake becomes less as well. If you take a look at the same results, so when you're giving disgust sweat this time, here, and that's the disgust sweat. This is the levator labii, that's actually the relevant muscle. It gets activated substantially, significantly, whereas the other odors don't activate the facial muscle. So you have some indication of what's going on. There are other measures, which I'll go in the third one, cognitive measures, for instance. Here's, let's say, a happy face. There you have different muscles activated, orbicularis oculi, levator labii, and the zygomaticus. The zygomaticus is the one you can fake easily. If you want to see if somebody's faking a smile, then you won't see these two activated. So you can take a look at politicians, and then you'll see if they're fake smiles or real smiles. Here we have a cognitive task. The participants get this as a first sample, and then say the task is to decide what is similar to that, this one or that one, and there's no right or wrong answer. Well, when people are in a positive mindset, when they're actually feeling in a positive mood or a positive emotional state, they have a global experience. They see things in global ways. They don't look at fine detail. Everything, you give generalized answers. If, however, you're in a fear state, you're alert and taking a look at the different types of little details that are relevant because you want to actually defend yourself. Well, what does that mean here in terms of the cognitive task? Do the odors, comparison of the fear and happiness odor, show any systematic difference in the way people say which one is more similar to this? Okay? So when they're happy, they take a generalized view, overall global view. The global view is an overall square. You neglect the details. Therefore, you go to the global view here, which is a square, but with triangles now. When you're afraid, you go to detail. You say, oh, this is a small rectangle, this is a, et cetera, et cetera. This one. Although the global view of this one is a triangle. So when you are in a positive state, you go choose this one. When you're when you're in a happy state, and when you're in a fear state, you go this. And that's precisely what the odor does. So the odors, the happiness odor and the fear odor, when you compare them, give precisely the systematic results that influencing the cognitive processing abilities of the person. Okay. The next question is about whether olfactory processing is evolutionary conserved, which means does it have a interspecies effect in the first place? That was the question we asked, and we examined olfactory communication with dogs. So is there anything special about smell-related brain regions? And in the human, or in the general evolution, in mammals, the olfactory section is actually precedes other sensory domains and their development. So it's actually very original in terms of time region. Chemical stimuli are really special in a sense, particularly in the olfactory sense, because the reception of a chemical stimulus and the reaction of different receptors is without any transduction. So when you talk, you have to actually re-represent different steps until you can have a neural representation of it. But when you're exposed to the chemo signal, it really mixes immediately with the nerves that are actually the receptors. So there's a very special situation with respect to chemical stimuli. And the question we ask is, can they play a significant role for the transmission and activation of emotion within and between species? Do they allow communication? The within, I showed. There's a lot of evidence for that. The between didn't exist until this. So we started studying dogs. Why did we study dogs? Well, the domestication history of dogs goes back 15,000 or more years. So there's a substantial, quotes, collaboration between the two species. And it's possible that this communication is more readily available. We're going to study other species as well, but this was the first one we did. So this is research done together with my colleague in University of Napoli, Biagio and Danielo. First experiment, we had dogs, Labradors, exposed to happiness and fear odors. This is the experimental setup. On the left, you see the owner of the dog. On the right, a stranger, is actually the experimenter. The odor is in this container, and now watch what the dog does, if this works. Ta-da. Okay. So it goes to smells the odor, starts and socializes. I mean, that's really. And this thing is a heartbeat monitor. So we're measuring at the same time heartbeat. Now, in this case, we have fear. Again, the same set of dog smells. And settles down. We've done this with more than 40 dogs. The results are very consistent. And there's a very clear transmission of emotion via chemo signals. Now, it's possible that this is due to learning as well. We can't conclusively say that this is actually something that's given through the universality of the chemo signal. It's possible that actually dogs have learned this. We have to study other species, for particularly non-domestic. So we're going to hopefully do some studies with wolves in Vienna. So, this is reaching the end. I'm going to close this. I can't tell how long I've spoken. Since Rui didn't interrupt me, I'm okay, because he's really a tough chair. Here are some questions that are actually prevalent. One of them is, what is the chemical composition of sweat produced in specific situations? What are the particular molecules, or what makes the compound of sweat? It's actually something that's not been examined. And in fact, we have currently a Horizon 2020 program over a 5-year period with 10 universities collaborating. The aim is to disentangle the chemical composition of sweat. Not only the chemical composition of sweat in general, but sweat that produces happiness versus fear, etc. So what are the chemical differences between the different types of excretions? Another question which we're not addressing, but it's an important question to address, and it's a challenging question. What happens to your body what type of hormonal changes take place that actually affect the particular type of secretions that are produced. So that's an interesting question which is not being addressed yet. And then another question is, what are the dangers of sweat produced under different conditions? Because if we can actually take the hypothetical case that we can analyze the chemical composition, and a part of the project is actually developing technical facilities to distribute it in space, like in here. I mean, if I had the facilities, I would have distributed happiness sweat here, and you would have loved my lecture. In 5 years' time, perhaps. But the danger in that is an ethical one, in the sense that if I have the possibility, that's the first thing that comes to mind. So can I make a striking, protesting bunch of workers happy by spreading happiness? It doesn't work that way. See, if you go to a film that is humorous, a television series, you will notice that there is laughter there. It's called, as you probably know, canned laughter. So it's actually artificial. You know, you plug it in and then it actually affects you. And I have done some entertainment things, not here, where you show, for instance, Mr. Bean with and without sound, and it falls flat completely. If you take a tragedy and produce canned laughter, it will have no effect whatsoever because the people are not ready. They are looking at something which is actually tragic. So in a sense, for the type of analysis and synthetic production to have any effect, people have to be ready for it. If there is no readiness, then it will not affect anybody. So the ethical problems are not as dramatic as one thinks, but they are still worthwhile considering. And in fact, in the project, we have an entire group of lawyers and ethics people as part of the project, controlling what we're doing and giving us advice. What benefits does sweat produced under different conditions have? Well, one benefit is the first time we produced our result on fear and disgust, Philips in Eindhoven approached us to talk about what they could do with it. One of the things that they were concerned with was when you go into an MRI machine, it's claustrophobic and it's frightening. It is actually, if anybody has done it, they'll know what it's like. So you're afraid. Well, what you do is excrete volatiles, fear odor. And that stays in the machine. So because of that, they have then introduced ventilators to extract after each patient is there, to extract the air out of it. So that's one of the type of benefit that you can have. Just one example. Another example is, and that's part of the project that we have, but other people are doing it as well, does it help with clinical cases when people are depressed, anxious? Can the molecules that we have help them improve themselves? It's a question that's not answered yet, but at least in those cases there's readiness, and if that can be useful, then it's a beneficial effect of the research on this thing. But that's the point at which I come to a conclusion, and thank you very much for listening. And
thank you, Gunn. I promise you, I'm going to take my dogs to help me in tasting wine. Oops. Sorry. Oh, Jesus. Give me 1 second, please. Believe it or not, I was the first assistant on computers in my university. Meus queridos amigos, após uma auspiciosa estreia de uma peça de teatro de Bernard Shaw em Londres, que teve um enorme sucesso, uma senhora aproximou-se do autor no fim e perguntou-lhe: mestre, o que é que existe entre o riso e as lágrimas? E Bernard Shaw respondeu-lhe: é o nariz. É precisamente para falar do nariz que eu me encontro aqui. E quando há alguns meses o professor Marçal Grilo me convidou para falar sobre o olfato neste ciclo de conferências, eu aceitei, enfim, com toda a amizade e consideração que tenho por ele, mas só posteriormente dei conta dos ilustríssimos oradores destes convidados académicos, sábios, todos altamente profissionais, e eu sou um mero amador, e quando dei por isto fiquei a pensar com os meus botões, ai, Zé, vais meter o nariz, mas ao menos onde sou chamado. E, de facto, o meu trabalho é cheirar. Eu tenho que cheirar milhares de amostras de vinho e de anotar todos os aromas que deles emanam. A propósito de cheirar e do cérebro, deixem-me contar-vos uma história. Há uns anos, aqui em Lisboa, Jacques Polge. Jacques Polge era, ainda existe, ele é vivo, já não é, mas era o perfumista da Chanel. Ele detesta que lhe chamem perfumista. Ele é o nez da Chanel, o nariz da Chanel. E o nez da Chanel veio fazer uma conferência a Lisboa. Era inverno, estava assim um bocadinho constipado e fanhoso como eu, e alguém da assistência lhe disse no fim: mas o senhor, quando está assim constipado, não tem cheiro, não pode criar perfumes. E ele, com alguma surpresa para ele, pela pergunta, e para todos nós, pela resposta, disse: mas eu não crio perfumes com o nariz, eu crio perfumes com a cabeça. Ele cria perfumes com o próprio cérebro. Eu não estou nesse caso, não é o meu caso, porque eu não crio. Eu não crio absolutamente nada, estou simplesmente a identificar, ou a tentar identificar, o maior número de indicadores possíveis, os aromas, os chamados descritores organoléticos do vinho, para, em determinado momento, definir um vinho. Explico rapidamente porquê. Nós produzimos todos os anos vinhos. E, em determinada altura, por exemplo, em março, é uma altura importante, porque os vinhos já fermentaram, estão nas barricas, nós vamos provar as barricas todas e tomamos nota de tudo. É não com o interesse de perceber se os vinhos, enfim, claro que vemos se os vinhos estão bons ou maus, mas o interesse é descrevê-los com rigor para podermos comparar o que é que se passava em março de 2013, por exemplo, ou em março de 2014 ou 2015. Os outros vinhos tinham tido condições diferentes, tinha chovido mais, tinha havido mais calor, e isso é importante e rigoroso que nós tomemos nota de tudo aquilo que somos capazes para identificar os aromas de cada um dos vinhos. É um trabalho profissional, é um trabalho cansativo, por vezes até exaustivo, onde se procura rigor e não nem prazer nem emoção. Bem pelo contrário, nessa altura o meu cérebro não está focado em saber se aquele vinho tem alguma coisa que me desperte interesse, mas exclusivamente no rigor racional e preciso da sua identificação organolética. A propósito disto, o ex-diretor da Christie's em Londres, Michael Broadbent, costumava dizer que há apenas duas formas de beber vinho. A dos amadores, que em princípio somos todos nós quando bebemos vinho, e que bebemos vinho para lhes descobrir as qualidades. E depois há os profissionais. Eu, por exemplo, quando tenho que provar vinhos para os descrever, que provamos vinhos para lhe encontrar os defeitos. E é uma grande diferença entre uma prova emocional de querer tirar partido de um vinho, um prazer, ou uma prova racional onde pretendemos ser rigorosos na nossa avaliação. Quando eu bebo vinho por puro prazer, nas refeições, jamais me passa pela cabeça ir analisar, fazer aqueles gestos todos, de cheirar e ver e tentar adivinhar o que é que lá está e o que é que lá não está lá. Porque esse não é o objetivo. O objetivo que eu tenho do vinho é encontrar o prazer. E isso obtém-se, esse prazer que o vinho me provoca, essa emoção, obtém-se de um conjunto de circunstâncias, de uma harmonia, de qualquer coisa, que é um conjunto e não uma análise detalhada de cada ponto. Deixem-me fazer uma pergunta à audiência na generalidade, que podem fazer o favor, se me fizerem esse favor, de responder de braço no ar. Quem é que aqui na assistência bebe vinho? Uau! Só um momento. São precisamente 83,4%. É de facto quase toda a gente, é um número muito interessante. E agora a segunda pergunta é esta, mas porquê é que as pessoas bebem vinho? Bom, sabem a curiosidade, se formos à net e pusermos lá porquê é que as pessoas bebem vinho, a resposta, mas são dezenas delas, podem fazer a experiência, dizem que é porque o vinho faz bem à saúde. E eu pergunto, mas nesse caso talvez valesse a pena beber óleo de figo de bacalhau. É extraordinário como é que estas coisas dão a volta. E não é uma coisa tão simples. Desde há 6.000 anos, ou com mais de 6 ou 8.000 anos que se bebe vinho, que as pessoas bebem vinho exclusivamente por razão, porque lhes sabe bem. Ponto final. O vinho é para ser bom. É uma frase do Jacques Puiset. Ou seja, o vinho serve para nos dar prazer. Então, pergunto uma coisa. Se o grande objetivo de beber vinho é um prazer, uma emoção, uma satisfação, o que é o vinho? O que é isso? O que é esse líquido? Pasteur definiu, e a partir daí é definitivo. Vinho é o resultado da fermentação natural do sumo de uva. Simples. Isto resolve o problema de distinguir o que é vinho de todos os outros líquidos. Um líquido que não seja fermentação natural do sumo de uva não é vinho. E vinho é isso. Mas será que, com esta definição tão simples, se consegue identificar mesmo o que é o vinho? Ou seja, diferenciá-lo entre si? Como é que nós conseguimos perceber nesta questão do vinho que haja, por exemplo, Há alguns vinhos, ou muitos vinhos, que uma garrafa custa 1 euro ou 2, e haja vinhos que uma garrafa custa 5.000 ou mais euros. Aí tem que haver aqui uma diferença. Isto não é natural que possa ser, que estejamos a falar da mesma coisa. E todos sabemos que não estamos a falar da mesma coisa. De facto, eu costumo dizer que, para mim, o vinho é um mistério. E que toda a minha vida dedicada ao vinho, estudando, provando, bebendo, produzindo, experimentando, tudo ou quase tudo no vinho, ainda hoje continuo a dizer que o vinho é um mistério, mesmo ultrapassando largamente as 10.000 horas de dedicação que sugere o Malcolm Gladwell no seu livro, em que diz que para se ter sucesso em qualquer coisa é preciso primeiro ter 10.000 horas de experiência. Uma vida inteira dedicada ao vinho e não chega para compreender o que é o vinho. Daí, como vos disse, que o vinho, para mim, continua a ser um mistério. E, no entanto, é qualquer coisa de muito simples. O vinho é uma quantidade de água muito grande. 80% a 90% é água. Depois há uma quantidade de álcool significativa. Varia de 8% a 15%, números, enfim, sem um rigor por aí além. Mas deixa-nos apenas menos de 1% para tudo o resto. E, curiosamente, é neste tudo o resto que está tudo. É neste menos de 1% que estão todas as diferenças que justificam um vinho valer 1 euro ou 5.000. É curioso isto. Nós temos aqui qualquer coisa que vale a pena perceber. Esse menos de 1% são componentes aromáticos, ácidos, açucarados, açúcares mesmo, corantes, enfim. Há uma série de elementos que, quando nós provamos um vinho, há elementos que são tácteis, ou seja, os que a gente todos sabem, ouviram falar nos taninos, elementos, a temperatura do vinho, são elementos que são apercebidos pela boca com tato. Mas depois há os outros elementos do gosto, o ácido, o açúcar, o salgado e o amargo, que são percebidos pelas papilas gustativas que temos na língua. E a diferença aí entre os vinhos não é gigantesca, não faz aquela diferença. Onde, de facto, há uma grande diferença é nos compostos aromáticos, que, como sabem, no vinho, para além de cheirarmos, depois no gosto, vêm no gosto, nos aromas retronasais. Ora bem, se são esses aromas que fazem toda a diferença, e é muito fácil prová-lo, se nós provarmos qualquer vinho, ou qualquer outra coisa, de nariz tapado, não damos por nada. Mas se quiserem chegar a casa e experimentar um copo de vinho e um café, à temperatura do vinho, é evidente, não põe o café a ferver, mas à temperatura do vinho não são capazes sequer de distinguir o que é vinho e o que é café. E, portanto, talvez por isso, toda a gente quer, quando eu ouço as pessoas dizem eu gostava de saber mais de vinhos, vou fazer um curso de vinhos, e imediatamente querem descobrir os aromas que estão lá dentro do vinho. E andam para ali, mas o vinho tem isto e tem aquilo, e tem frutos vermelhos, e tem, enfim, aquela coisa toda, e querem identificá-los à exaustão como se isso é que desse prazer. E pensem bem, todos vós já leram críticas de vinhos nas revistas, nos livros. Os críticos de vinhos que usam os mais inimagináveis, excêntricos e até estapafúrdios termos para identificar os vinhos. Deixem-me dar-vos, só por graça, alguns exemplos absolutamente reais de críticos de vinhos. Molho de figo, bico de lápis, Viagra líquido, autêntico. Pelo de cão molhado. E eu não resisti a trazer-vos esta descrição de um vinho branco, de um autor reconhecido. Mistura caleidoscópica de musgo, pedra molhada, genciana, coentros, pimenta de Szechuan, óleo de noz, sopa de amêijoas, pêssego e limão, numa vibrante salivação e complexidade dinâmica. Querem mais? Melhor? Mas, meu Deus, como é que isto... Como é que isto... E nós vivemos todos disto e aceitamos, e enfim, e até já nos parece bem, mas há uma razão. Isto historicamente tem uma... E é curioso, basta perceber isso para perceber o que é que se passa. Eu gostava de falar aqui da velha dupla razão ou emoção, ou aquilo que o professor António Damasio nos explica no seu livro O Erro de Descartes. Descartes, e muitos pensam que um dia a ciência vai acabar por dar resposta a isto tudo. E é aí que o professor António Damasio fala das emoções. Quem me dera eu saber mais neste campo para poder perceber ainda melhor, mas acho que posso transmitir que é perceptível, é facilmente perceptível, que os Estados Unidos da América tiveram uma lei seca. Já produziam vinho e tal, mas durante a lei seca acabou-se. E quando acabou a lei seca, isto é no princípio do século XX, a Califórnia começa a produzir vinho. Mas, à maneira americana, a Califórnia, quando começa a ter importância na produção de vinho, faz imediatamente, cria uma universidade, a famosíssima Universidade Davis, dedicada ao estudo da vinha e do vinho, que faz um trabalho hoje mundialmente reconhecido e aceito como o mais importante trabalho que nos permite hoje nós dizermos na generalidade não há vinhos maus, nem aqui em Portugal, nem noutro sítio. Melhorou-se imenso, porque hoje se conhecem todos os pormenores que se passam desde o tratamento das vinhas, das uvas, das fermentações, de tudo. A parte científica do vinho aumentou imenso. Ora bem, e os nossos amigos americanos tinham esse poder, essa capacidade, mas não tinham uma coisa. Não tinham o vinho do Porto, não tinham um vinho Madeira, não tinham um grande vinho de Bordeaux, não tinham com certeza o Romanée Conti da Borgonha. E isso são referências extraordinárias que os americanos não tinham. E quando nem tinham, nem demorariam dezenas de anos para chegar a ter. E então houve todo um esforço para, digamos, reduzir tudo a uma questão científica. Há uma curiosidade. A Universidade de Davis, uma das palavras que desde sempre se utilizou no vinho e que os franceses usam muito, e acho que é autodescritivo, é dizer um vinho de grande finesse. A finesse num vinho, não é possível traduzir, mas percebe-se muito bem. Isto era um vinho de uma grande finesse. Pois bem, a Universidade de Davis proibiu a utilização dessa palavra em relação aos vinhos porque não era definível em parâmetros. Não se conseguia... A finesse não pode ser 4 ou 14. E tentaram desenvolver uma ciência que permitisse a comparação de vinhos tout court. Foi nessa altura, enfim, mais tarde, eu estou a falar no tempo, que a doutora Anne Noble, que foi uma cientista que dedicou toda a sua vida a estudar os aromas do vinho, que fez este trabalho. Enfim, isto é a roda dos aromas. Ela conseguiu descobrir que tudo isto, estão aqui estes aromas, os aromas químicos, que podem ser aromas de petróleo, aromas de enxofre, pungentes, aromas pungentes que podem ser quentes e frios, e sei lá, aromas oxidados, por aí os florais, as especiarias, os herbáceos, os vegetais, os caramelos, e definiu isto tudo para se poder, como se alguém, se fosse possível ter uma máquina que descobrisse tudo isso que tem um vinho, se viesse a saber se o vinho era bom ou mau. Todos os vinhos têm isto tudo, os bons e os maus. Não é isso que os distingue. Mas conseguiu-se passar a imagem que há alguém que conseguisse ter a roda dos aromas na cabeça, que a partir daí era um expert a definir o que era um vinho bom ou um vinho mau. E para culminar isto, nos Estados Unidos, o Sr. Robert Parker pôs a cereja em cima do bolo. Fez uma classificação baseada em 100 pontos. E a partir daí, quanto é que vale este vinho? 87 pontos. E aquele, 89. Então aquele é melhor. E nós deixámos de existir. O gosto, a oportunidade, o ambiente, tudo o que está à volta reduziu-se a um número, o que também é extraordinário, e teve uma influência no comportamento das pessoas e dos produtores no vinho para comporem vinhos que dessem origem a aproximar dos 100 pontos, que é um fenómeno ainda hoje estudado e extraordinário. Passámos então de uma apreciação do vinho perfeitamente subjetiva, pessoal, emocional, para uma apreciação rigorosa, científica e impessoal. Como se fosse possível, comparemos com a pintura. Imaginemos que olhávamos para, sei lá, para a Ronda da Noite do Rembrandt e para a Guernica do Picasso. E alguém dizia, mexendo bem pintura, bem, eu à Ronda da Noite dou 98 pontos. E aqui à Guernica dou 97,5. Então a Ronda da Noite é melhor. Este tipo de análise entrou dentro dos espíritos quase de toda a gente que bebe vinho. Ou, por outro lado, dizer que a descrição... mas explique-me lá, diga-me lá o que é a Ronda da Noite e diga-me o que é a Guernica do Picasso. E alguém disse assim, espera aí, olha, veja ali os amarelos ali são um bocadinho mais gemadouve, ali são mais torrados, os cinzentos são mais esbatidos aqui. Então, mas eu vou descrever um quadro pelas tonalidades das cores, como isto é a roda das cores que todos os pintores usam. Mas são os pintores. Nós não precisamos de saber isto para apreciar um quadro e para saber de pintura. E já repararam como é similar a roda dos aromas com a roda das cores? Muitos amigos meus dizem-me assim, eu não percebo nada de vinhos. Não é verdade. Não é verdade porque também há pessoas que dizem, todos sabem, eu não tenho ouvido para a música, tenho ouvidos rombos e tal. Reparem uma coisa, este miserável telemóvel toca. Eu atendo e alguém diz do lado de lá, está. Mais nada. E eu respondo, olá mãe. E mais, sei se ela está bem disposta, se ela está ansiosa, se ela está aborrecida, se ela precisa de carinho, por uma simples palavra. Então, a minha audição não é extraordinária? Os meus sentidos, todos, não são absolutamente extraordinários? Não temos aparelhos sensoriais maravilhosos que nos põem em contacto com o mundo e são capazes de percepcionar, nos fazer chegar as sensações e depois, com a cooperação do nosso maravilhoso cérebro, transformá-la nas mais extraordinárias emoções. Essas emoções passam pelo equilíbrio, pela complexidade, pela tensão, pela harmonia, e isso passa-se no vinho, passa-se na música e passa-se na pintura. Todos eles nos provocam diferentes emoções por causa destas componentes. Sem precisar de aprender solfejo, de decorar a roda das cores ou a roda dos aromas, acreditemos profundamente na nossa capacidade própria de saber dizer que gostamos ou não gostamos de um vinho. O nosso sistema olfativo e o nosso cérebro fazem o resto. Todos nós nascemos com essas capacidades. E, portanto, o que há que fazer é beber vinho e com moderação. Muito obrigado.
Can I sit here? Excelente.
I had a simultaneous translation. It's fantastic.
Okay, so it is now time to initiate the dialogue itself. The challenge that we posed to our speakers tonight was for each of them to prepare a question to the other. So I will open that. I'm now speaking English maybe to balance a bit the session that we have conducted mainly in Portuguese. After that, we will open the dialogue to the audience, and everybody is welcome to put questions in either English or Portuguese. Either way, we can translate, and there's also simultaneous translation, so language should not be a barrier for our dialogues here tonight. So I would start with Gun also here, asking Gun if you would like to question José about the amazing
I'm very curious.
talk. Okay.
The way you pronounce my name sounds very threatening. Gun. I mean, that's not my name. Gun is better, yes.
Okay.
When you were talking, I missed the first bit because I couldn't work this thing, but something struck me. You were talking about the different critics and the flowery language they use to describe wine. You were also talking about the hat you have when you're analyzing something, which is taking things apart, compared to when you have your pleasure, which is entirely different. You can't put those two things in the same hat. And what struck me, if this is correct, the linguistic analysis doesn't do justice to the particular quality that wine has. So it actually dissects wine into something which it is not. Am I exaggerating this? Because I think analyzing something on occasions, particularly when it's not analyzable with the particular senses that are involved, the sense of smell, sense of taste at the same time, which defies language. And then trying to put what's happening in language actually kills the precise aspect of what the sensation is. Does that make sense? Is that?
Absolutely, absolutely. In wine, we use essentially metaphors to describe a wine. There is a very simple metaphor that I used to give as an example when Romeo tells Juliet up in the veranda or balcony, you are the sun. Of course, it's a lie. She is not the sun. But it's easier for somebody that writes a piece of theater to say it much more, everybody understands. So in wine, we use words like a very elegant wine or whatever, finesse. And all these metaphors are, well, it depends on somebody that tries to transmit a sensation. And if we go back 50 years ago, there was only 4 words to define a wine, or a coffee, or whatever. It was, what we say about a coffee, oh, this extraordinary, it's excellent coffee, or, oh, it's a very good coffee, or a very good wine. It's not bad, it's reasonable wine, or, wow, it's awful wine, awful coffee. That was enough. But with the necessity of filling newspapers, magazine, books, authors tend to use more and more and more terms, and some of them found a kind of protection trying to find out these silly words to describe a wine. And there is now a tendency to restrict the words and trying to define the words just to have a few differences between different wines and to be more specific. That's a tendency, and many people, or some authors and philosophers are trying to express lexicus, lexicus expressly for wine. And I think that within a few years we will be much more precise.
But I mean, is what you're implying that if you try to represent something in a medium language that is not representable in that medium, you're actually destroying the object itself. So you should, what you're tending to is forget about the descriptions, enjoy.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. I have a question for you.
Okay.
And that's a really, it happens to me a few years ago. I was dreaming, after reading a few books, and I was dreaming that I was at the airport, and there was one of these machines that we can buy a coffee or buy a... This was a machine, a dispenser, a wine dispenser, okay? And it cost €2. I put the €2, and I looked at all the buttons and said, type of wine, red, rosé, white, red. And then what country? France. And then region, Bordeaux. And sub-region, Pomerol. And what wine? Petrus. Here, 82, the best. And for €2, I got a plastic glass with the best wine in the world. And I was so happy. I was dreaming, but I really was happy. And suddenly, you know, all these dreams, they never finish well. And suddenly, I looked at the glass of water and said, but I'm not going to drink wine anymore. Can you understand that? No, I was not interested. Wine became... There was something that... If I could touch a button and receive that wine, for all my life I wouldn't drink anything else. I wouldn't have any comparison. And you are a psychologist. You can certainly explain to me.
Interesting experience. I mean, I'll compliment that before I try to think to give an answer. When I first arrived in the UK, which is last millennium, you had in pubs different types of ales and beers and things like that, ales particularly, and then you had wine. And it was either red or white, orthogonally balanced with cold or warm. So that put you off wine immediately, although the ales I didn't like. But in the case of you being able to specify precisely what you want for €2 in a plastic cup, I think it was the cup that put you off and not the wine.
Oh, yeah, maybe. You know, about the cup, let me tell you one thing. There is a fussy thing. Everybody wants a fantastic cup. Now, this crystal, very expensive. One glass for each wine. We need to have at home thousands of different glasses if we want to fulfill all these things. Well, and I guess that about 7,000-8,000 years ago in India, they had that glass covered by gold, which transformed anything that we put there in the elixir or whatever you say of youth. So basically, that's the theory of the Grahal.
Yes.
It's not the liquid, it's the glass that transforms the liquid.
Yes.
So now they sell, and they sell at enormous prices. But everybody is convinced that if the white is good, the wine becomes good. And I tell you, that's not true.
That's not the case. So I have a question myself for both of you. So there's this linguistic barrier to express the sense of smell that Gun has mentioned.
Yes.
And you have also mentioned the difficulty of expressing how wines smell and taste. Would it be a way to use your approach, or for example, measuring facial expressions to express the emotion of having a particular type of wine? Would we be able to envisage some kind of installation like the Brain Orchestra that could have the emotions of the wine in our exhibit? Where
No problem.
No problem?
No.
So can we challenge you both to embark on that? So what would be your comments on using a non-linguistic approach to express that?
Well, I think that it's a little bit obvious that our face expresses exactly not the pleasure, but the sensation. The first sensation is, even if it is a very good wine, but we are not used to, somebody that never had drunk a wine, so it can have a bad face because it doesn't like it. And then later on, and this happens. On the contrary, somebody can have saying that, oh, that's a very nice wine, because it's a very normal, banal, not sophisticated.
So familiarity would
yes,
play a role.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
That's a very good point, because I know without my parents' knowledge, I drank wine once, and I really did not like it. It was the first time. So getting used to it and getting familiar with what you're drinking makes a huge difference. I was thinking jokingly that it's no problem. I mean, you know, the main problem is, in a sense, if you want to do it empirically like that, by measuring things, there are enormous individual differences in taste. So you're not getting a reading that's going to help you overall to judge the quality. And that's, I think, a question that may be worthwhile thinking about. If you took a lot of different people tasting the same wine and asked them what they think of it, pleasant, unpleasant, likable, not likable, or even more differentiated, like the diverse concepts, you will get an enormous variation. So you will not be able to come up with a standard. 28% of the people say this is excellent, and wood, whatever, it's rosewood or something like that. I think it's impossible to actually create some standardization of taste by making a survey.
So I think we could now open the discussion to the audience. If there are people interested in Portuguese or English, please. There's one question here. There's a microphone coming.
Hello. I have a question that's for both of you. Where does the linguistic barrier come from? Like, we can conceptualize love, we can paint love or all, but I really can't imagine a smell that brings that. Like, that linguistic barrier comes from something. Do you know where it comes from? Thank you.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
that's for you.
I have been commissioned to give the BS. Let me start with something else. If I gave you a manual, very detailed, about how to ride a bicycle, do you think by memorizing it you'll be able to ride? Same problem. So there are certain types of activities that are very difficult to transduce into, in this case, motor activity, and the same thing with the smell, particularly because the first locations that the smell reaches has nothing to do with our linguistic centers. So they are located somewhere else, and therefore there is a barrier, but it's also a natural barrier in a sense, a brain barrier if you want.
Okay. Other questions? Microphone.
I took a shower this morning. I used shampoo and soap as natural. But now, if someone smells my armpit, it's body odor, because I don't use deodorant. Why I'm not allowed to have body odor? Why am I supposed to smell like flowers?
There is no prohibition, of course, but do you want to answer that? Well, first of all, that's is a cultural implicit norm. And the second thing is the sweat itself actually is without any odor. It's the bacteria that actually combine with the excretion that give rise to the smell. So why it is not allowed, it's a cultural norm. I mean, people say, well, you know, you smell bad, I can't sit next to you. Partly also because, I don't mind my own smell, but I don't think I will be particularly appreciative of the qualities that you exude with your own smell. So it's difficult.
There's another question here in the front, and then another one there.
I'd like to ask you both about the difference between present and future, in the sense that both of you have used epiphenomics and phenomenology to describe the physicality of smell. And it seems to me, I'd like to know, you who are scientists or connoisseurs, what can we expect from the future? Because I was pretty much disappointed is not the word, but felt that we are so much in the past, having neurology, trying to understand what things are, but what muscles are triggered by that. It seems such a naive and raw approach into the science. Like it was, you know, I know that neurology nowadays is like in the dawn of its real knowledge, but what could we imagine from the future to know much beyond the physicalities and the epiphenomenology of things, you know, of the reactions of things. When are we going to get to know the substance and not the phenomenon that we see being in language or in magical terms, as he said, or in physical reactions? You know, when are we going to get to physical science of itself and not of the phenomena? phenomenon.
I leave this to you.
Well,
I'm sorry, it's unfair.
I'm sorry, I'm a humble wine producer. I can't go much further than this. But talking about future, there is something that today is really different from the past. In the past, we didn't have in food and wine and these type of things, the industrialization that we have now. And the knowledge that science brought to these things is so big that, well, I'm telling this not because I have studied or because I'm reading books, but today there are means to have a box that is so attractive that we think that the inside is the best in the world. So it's language, it's the images, whatever. And what really happened in wine, and that's what I can tell you, is that the totality of the wine that today, at this moment, is sold and drunk around the world, 97% of those bottles cost less than $10, saying €7. You don't need to be a wine producer to understand that it's not very easy. Because when I talk €7, just follow me. You have to take off the IVA, the TVA, VAT. So it's €6. Then you have 50% at least for distribution. It's €3. Then it comes to €3, and then you have to discount the bottle, the case, the bottling, the marketing, everything. So the producer of the best wine of this 97% around the world has $1.5, $2 saying maximum to produce a great wine. What happens is that, of course, there are very good wines under this level, but basically producers are obliged to produce the same thing for the people, for the market studies, for whatever it is. They like now a little bit more alcohol. They produce wines with alcohol, or with sugar, or whatever it is. And these products became standard. There is a standardized taste all around the world. In food, we are, yesterday I read that exactly 30% of the vegetables that Americans eat, 30% are chips, batata frita. And this is new. I didn't know that, but the chips, the batata frita, came to America after First World War. The soldiers brought the batata frita. And, so this phenomena is what is happening. So very nice vineyards, people that could produce not only wine, but potatoes, anything, well, vegetables. We are at a certain stage having a tendency to have these small productions, organic, paying attention to that, but the industry is swallowing all these with interest, which is normal, and I don't know if in the future we will have much more standardized items than today.
You want to add something? Or? Okay. So there was one question there on the left.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for both of you for your enlightening conference, I think. One of the questions I had, I think it's mainly for the professor, which is, talking about smell, I remember my grandmother's stew, for example, and that triggers certain effects in my brain, which is kind of correlated to the memory. So I was wondering, while you were speaking about a happiness smell, if there would be a molecule in the smell itself that would trigger it, or if it's the brain that has to have that certain memory already incorporated for the smell to be able to make the connection to trigger that happiness. For example, could there be then a molecule in a smell naturally that would come to trigger that process in the brain without having the brain itself having the correlation to that memory? Or does my question make sense? Or
I think I understand. You can see the hesitation. First of all, the memory center of the brain is very close to the amygdala, which is the seat of emotions, not only. And amygdala has a direct link to synapses to the smell organs. So smell has an effect on memory, very strong effect on memory. And if you ask people to report their oldest memories, they'll say, well, you know, I remember when I was 14, etc., etc. But when you ask them to think about the smell, then they go much earlier. So smell actually consolidates memories much more strongly. Now the question you're asking, in a sense, is also related to, well, is there any molecule in the odor that actually can have a binding effect? I think it's actually basically what happens in the brain rather than in the odor itself, the composition of the odor.
So with that answer, would it be possible to have a happiness molecule, or you need to have a happy brain to experience the happiness molecule?
If our team finds the happiness molecule, we will be very rich.
Okay.
I would like to know something. I work with blind people, so with blind people, the smell and the taste, they are different, okay? So the synapses that I ask if we can consider that it's more faster than in the other people. That's true, because with the wine, they can smell and they can have the taste more faster than the others. That's my question. The synapses, they are faster than the others with blind people?
That's, even for me, it's a very interesting question, because I've been involved in wine for almost all my life, and actually should be tasters, blind tasters that could be better than every, and I never heard about that, frankly. But actually, something that is quite interesting to investigate. In principle.
Yeah, I mean, there are some blind tasters, aren't there? I mean, that's it. Isn't there a common competition that people don't see what they're tasting? And but that's different.
Yeah, that's different. Well, blind tasting in wines means that, of course, we don't know what we are tasting. But there's a great controversy if that helps or not, because the wine is a whole thing. It depends the way. Of course, that we have a extraordinary port wine, very rich, and we go and we drink it at the beach with 40 degrees. It's not nice at all. And even if it is, so if we have a wine tasting, a blind tasting of port wine at the beach, probably we say this is a very bad wine, and it is not. So there is a controversy on that, but that's different. What I'm telling you, as you said, is that should be blind people and visual people that could have a special. Well, there is one thing I know, is that there are super smellers, as there are super tasters. We heard about that, but I never heard anything about blind people.
But if I understood well the question, I think it's related to the interference that vision could have on assessing smell. And so, as we know that our experience of the world integrates different sensory modalities. If you are deprived of one of these modalities, you might enhance the other. I think that was the lines along which the question was asked. So do you know about the interference between vision and smell? There are cases that we were speaking yesterday, famous cases that vision interferes with taste, for example. And this is very well known. So I don't know if either of you want to elaborate a bit on these known interferences of vision on smell or taste. And examples you just gave yesterday.
Well, we know that if we taste wines, not blind tasting, but with the labels, if we have a wine that we know for experience, or that we know that that label is normally better, we have a tendency to classify it better than others. Like the same thing happens with prices. There are experiences precisely at Davis University. There are the pupils of the people of that university. They have groups where they taste different wines, basically wines around $5, $30, $35, and then $100. And they, at the middle of the tasting, they inform the prices. And there is a tendency to give a better number, of better classification to a more expensive. But then they repeat it, and for instance, if we put on a $5 wine a price of $100, saying that it is fantastic, normally people don't accept it. They, of course, they may classify it a little bit better, but they don't decide that this is the best wine I had in my life. So I believe that these type of studies are quite modern. They're trying the influences and all these things. But this is what I read or lately so about this.
I remember once, a long time ago, there was in Germany an ice cream parlor that opened, and their specialty was to present main courses in ice cream. So you were having, for instance, a hamburger with chips, but it was ice cream, sweet, different tastes, but had nothing to do with the hamburger, but it was quite disgusting. Just the interference between the vision and the memory associated with that and what you're expecting, ice cream, is just completely incongruent. And that conflict is very strong.
Okay. So if there are no further questions from the audience, I would like to thank both Nuno Schemin and José Bento Santos for their very interesting talks and for this very nice conversation. I would also invite you to come back to the Brain Dialogues. The next session, I think it's on May the 3rd, on the social brain. Before that, we might have some sessions from the Cinema Cycle or not. Please keep updated in our website. And thank you all for coming over tonight to join us in these Brain Dialogues. So thank you very much.
Thank you.